Thank you.
How do things look?
Good.
Very good. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Claude. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's truly wonderful to be able to talk to this audience, given all that's happening right now. There's 50 people. I don't know that I've given real life talks to 50 people very often. So it's a really nice opportunity, and I'm thankful for it. This talk today is a bit of a conceptual talk, and so I won't be presenting any data. So I suppose this is what happens when you work in a mathematics institute, as I do. But I hope perhaps some ideas here are of some interest. This is a talk about fitness landscapes. We heard something about empirical fitness landscapes in the previous talk by Joachim. As you know, as all of you know, this is an old idea that was introduced in the 30s by Wright in particular. And he formulated this picture, which has been influential. He said, the problem of evolution, as I see it, is that of the mechanism by which the species may continually find its way from lower to higher peaks. Of course, this was a metaphor back then, but we just heard that it's becoming a lot more real now that experiments are being conducted. And this is, in fact, going pretty fast. If you look at the rate of increase of publications that mention empirical fitness landscapes over time, you see that starting from the 90s, it's now really taking off, truly. This is wonderful, and we now have detailed maps of bacterial landscapes of the kinds that we just heard about, or molecular landscapes as well. So this is just a picture that I borrowed from a Chen paper, which shows the fitness landscape of a small ribozyme. And so we are now sort of peeking into the landscape of entire molecules. Those are really very large landscapes, but thanks to sequencing technologies, we can do that now. So this kind of progress seems to be conducive to an old dream, which is the dream of predicting evolution. And so this is why we see a surge of papers that go back to this old idea, which was often dismissed as truly impossible. One of the reasons is that we have now empirical data on fitness landscapes. So this is the question that sort of motivated me for this project. How should we think about predicting evolution given the kind of empirical fitness data we now have? The answer to this question strongly depends on the kinds of assumptions we make about evolutionary dynamics and the regimes that we're in. There are at least three main classes of models for evolutionary dynamics that correspond to different evolutionary phenomena. So if I'm picturing here a fitness landscape with different genotypes on the x-axis and their fitness on the y-axis, I can think of evolution in different ways. One is in terms of adaptive walks, which was implicit in the talk by Joachim Krog. This is the regime of evolution when there are few de novo mutants at each generation. So population size times mutation rate, that's smaller than one. And so evolution then is mostly a fitness increasing random walk in the landscape, an adaptive walk, so a so-called adaptive walk. This is a picture that's been useful to analyze the topography of landscapes, work by Krog in particular, often linking questions of epistasis and evolvability. Another class of models are fitness waves, which correspond to rapid adaptation. So truly the climbing of one big peak. And there, sort of interesting questions are that of the speed of evolution in relation to the population size in particular, the effect of stochasticity in the nose of the wave. All these questions are addressed within fitness wave models. And finally, there's a third class of models which are known as quasi-species type models that were introduced from the 80s onwards by Eigen, Schuster, and many other people. And they look at very different kinds of evolutionary regimes. Now you have a population that's very diverse genetically at all types. There are many de novo mutants that are occurring through mutations. This is a regime that's relevant for viral evolution, molecular evolution. I'll say a bit more about this just now. Just to say that the kinds of questions that are addressed there involve error thresholds, issues related to mutational robustness, and so on. And so what I want to picture with this slide is that there are different models corresponding to different regimes asking different questions, providing different answers to the question of predictability, and finally, involving different kinds of mathematics. Adaptive walks are Markov processes in fitness landscapes. Fitness waves involve PDEs and stochastic PDEs. Quasi-species theory, on the other hand, is about infinite populations and therefore deals with ordinary differential equations. So this is kind of the landscape of approaches to landscape dynamics. In this talk, I'll be focusing on the large population limit of evolution. So quasi-species evolution. So like I just said, this is a good model for evolution under high genetic diversity, something which is known to be applicable to RNA viruses, which can have up to 1 mutation per generation. You can think of other domains of application as well. Perhaps in immunity, affinity maturation can involve similar high mutation rates. There are experiments in molecular evolution where mutations are induced by PCR, for instance. That's also perhaps well addressed with quasi-species models. Maybe cancer, I don't know. There are talks of mutative phenotypes in cancer. I don't know much about this. I'm just raising the question. So this is the set of problems that can be addressed with models a la quasi-species. What is well understood from these models is the structure of the equilibrium distribution. So after a very long time, when the population has found its optimal place in the landscape and settles there, what can we say about this? The oldest set of results involve error thresholds, which is the statement that near a peak, a high peak in the landscape, the equilibrium distribution, which is a function of genotypes and mutation rates, it can have a phase transition with respect to mu. And so increasing the mutation rate can induce sudden changes in the composition of the population from a selective phase to a completely neutral phase when the population now doesn't see the landscape at all. It just looks flat, and so it diffuses everywhere. So that's one property of equilibrium distributions. Another in neutral evolution is the observation by Erik van Nimwegen and others that in a neutral network where genotypes are either viable, functional, or completely deleterious, when that's the case, quasi-species evolution brings the system to an equilibrium state, equilibrium between selection and mutations, which corresponds to the eigenvector centrality of the neutral network. So this is what is represented here. The population will basically go to the places that are more central in the network simply because those sequences, those genotypes are more robust by definition to mutations. So you can have the emergence of mutational robustness at equilibrium. What I think is not as well understood is perhaps the non-equilibrium dynamics. That is, when a viral population explores its fitness landscape, how does it move before it reaches these equilibrium configurations here? What about the possibility of crossing fitness valleys? Can we predict the trajectories that a population will take in a fitness landscape? So those are the questions that I'm thinking about. Okay, so the picture of evolution that we have in mind and really underlies quasi-species type modeling is that of a branching process. You have a diversity of possible genotypes, here labeled I, J, K, and so on. And genotypes can change through mutations, and they can grow through reproduction. This generates a tree, and to describe the evolution of that tree, you can use branching processes to describe the stochasticity in the growth of that tree, or simply differential equations for the mean behavior. Okay, so if I is a genotype and Ni is the number of that genotype in a population, in discrete time that evolves under a linear equation which involves a matrix M, which is defined as Mij is the expected number of J offspring of a given type I. So quasi-species equation is really describing the same thing, the mean behavior, but instead of representing it in terms of numbers, it represents it in terms of densities. And so now you have a nonlinear equation because normalization has to be preserved at all times. And you do that going from the mean matrix equation here for the branching process to there simply by dividing at all time steps by the mean fitness in the population. My point here is whether you think of this as quasi-species or branching processes, it's the same underlying picture of evolution as the generation of diversity and its natural selection through differential fitness, obviously. Okay, now there are some conceptual questions that can be raised from this picture. One of which has a long history is that of the definition of fitness, the meaningful notion of fitness. The classical notion of the number of offspring as the mean number of offspring as a measure of fitness, it's a good one, but it's myopic, and that's been stressed by many authors. It's myopic in the sense that you can have many different offspring and they are poor, they are not very fit themselves, and that doesn't give you a very long lineage. So it doesn't really see very far, it's short term. On the other hand, under quasi-species dynamics, if you let the population evolve to its selection mutation equilibrium, it will grow at a collective rate, which is given by an eigenvalue of the M matrix that I just talked about, lambda. And that is long-term, it's the opposite of what I just said, but now it's a property of the whole population as opposed to a measure that is local in the fitness landscape, or in other words, a function of a particular genotype. Okay, so which is better? Those are both useful notions, but they have different drawbacks. One is local but myopic, the other one is has foresight, but is population level. Another way of asking more or less the same question is, okay, so we have measured a fitness landscape. How does its topography guide evolution? Okay, so in the weak selection, in the weak mutation regime of adaptive walks, it's clear, evolution just goes up. But in quasi-species dynamics, things are a bit more complicated. We know from the work of Eric van Wegen and others that mutational robustness is also an optimum, also something that evolution will want to favor. And that can give rise to interesting crossovers between a regime in which the population does climb the highest peak, the survival of the fittest regime, which is represented in this picture here. At mutation rates that are not too high, population wants to climb the highest peak, but sometimes not. And it can be the case that at mutation rates that are a bit higher than this, instead of climbing the high peak, the population will want to concentrate at a lower but broader peak. So this is an instance of the survival of the flattest effect. And so in general, what you have here is clearly a trade-off between fitness, between robustness. It's not clear what evolution truly maximizes in the dynamics of quasi-species. And so this trade-off makes it a bit more difficult to think about predicting evolution, simply because it's not clear which part of the landscape a priori is the best. Finally, to predict evolution is to predict evolutionary trajectories, but again, if you're thinking of a branching process, there is not a meaningful notion of a trajectory. What you have is a population that's diverse. So what do we mean by predicting an evolutionary trajectory? So those are kind of conceptual questions that I'm hoping to address. And I want to address them with...
Matteo, can I mean, intuitively, can I just say like, hey, look, okay, there's a lot of small fitness differences that are kind of on the order of the mutation rate. You know, like on the order of like 10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 10 or something like that if we're talking about bacteria. But I could never measure those anyway, so I don't care. And then there's some big fitness differences that totally swamp all mutation. And then I don't need to worry about this, you know, flatness issue.
Yes, you are very welcome to continue the talk. I can go and get a pen now. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about in some systematic way, I hope. The mental models of fitness landscapes that I want us to have in the back of our minds is these three ones. A rugged landscape, the issue of ruggedness in evolution, which has to do with epistasis, the fact that there can be multiple peaks and that evolution involves looking for peaks. Another mental model is that of a heterogeneous graph. This is a picture of neutral evolution. Now, every dot here is a genotype, and it is there if it's fit. If it's not fit, it's not in the graph. This represents a neutral network, and the connections are neutral mutations linking genotypes. So another sort of mental model of evolution. And if you bring these two things together, ruggedness and neutrality, you can construct fitness landscapes that have both properties. There are parametric models for this, such as the NKP landscape. And here I'm showing an example where each dot now is an entire peak rather than just a single genotype. And I've connected them when they are adjacent. So you have this Bayesian hopping graph picture of a fitness landscape. And it gets complicated. This is a small, very small landscape, but you see it's complicated. So these three things we want to think about. Now, what I would like to do is introduce a concept, or maybe review a concept. Anyway, when I learned it, I thought it was really interesting. And that's the concept of the retrospective process. The retrospective process is a way of seeing quasi-species dynamics as a Markov process. Like the adaptive walk is a Markov process. And so because it's a Markov process, it gives a meaning to a notion of evolutionary trajectory. And I want to introduce an effective potential, which is a measure that blends fitness and robustness into just one number associated to a genotype. And that's the number that really is optimized, I will argue. And I'll review some applications of these ideas. Those are not real world applications. They are more conceptual applications, but I'll talk about them in a second part of the talk. Okay, so the retrospective view of evolution, the one that I'm promoting in this talk, is the following. A branching process is good, but in fact, when it comes to evolutionary dynamics, many branches in the tree won't matter because they are dead ends. So this is what I'm representing here. Evolution, if you think about it, truly is the structure and dynamics, not of all that branching, but only of those branches that are going to be successful, that have a future. And because success is atypical, this is really a sort of a narrow subset of all the things that are branching at all times. And I think what we want is to focus on those branches that really have a future. I would argue that an evolutionary trajectory is the succession of genotypes you see along those lineages that are successful, and that an evolutionary force is the force felt not by the whole population, but the effective force felt by these lineages that are successful. So now you start asking this question. Consider a branching tree and look at those lineages that are successful. What is the probability of going from genotype I to genotype J along those lineages? Keep in mind that the raw dynamics is defined by a matrix M, which gives the number of offspring of type J given a parent of type I. Now, the probability of I transitioning to J along successful lineages is given by a different matrix, not just M, but some combination of M and a new function R, which is the dominant right eigenvector of this matrix M. And I'll call this reproductive value, and I'll talk about this in a second. This construction now defines a Markov process, which is exactly going along those successful lineages. So that's what I mean by the retrospective process. Lambda is the dominant eigenvalue of the mean matrix here. So the key concept here is that of the reproductive value. So it's obvious what this is about. It's better to have few good offspring in the long term than a bunch of bad offspring that won't reproduce. The reproductive value of yellow is greater than the reproductive value of blue, although it has lower fitness, because its offspring are of better quality. This concept was introduced by Fisher, just like every other concept in this field, in the context of demography. And so he looked at age-structured population and talked about the contribution of females of different ages to the future population. Here, we are looking at the genotypic reproductive value, which is defined as the fraction of those asymptotic descendants of I that have that type. So the contribution of genotype I to the future population. And now what the retrospective does is to shift the emphasis from counting genotypes in the population to counting them with a weight, and that weight is their reproductive value. So by doing this, what you're really doing is really only counting those genotypes that will eventually matter. So it is retrospective in that sense. Now, what does this do? to go from one to the other. To give you some intuition, I've just simulated here a fitness wave where I'm plotting, so fitness wave here means that the axis here is fitness, and you have poorly adapted individuals that gradually will adapt. And I'm going to show you the distribution of genotypes in the population and the retrospective process that corresponds to it. One solves a nonlinear equation, the quasi-species equation. The other solves a linear Markovian equation. So it's clear what's happening here. The retrospective process moves at the same speed as the density, but it is a little bit in advance because at any given time, it represents those genotypes weighted by their future prospects. So in the tail of this distribution, you have the genotypes that will eventually matter, and that's what you're tracking here, okay? So it's in this sense that the retrospective process looks at the nose of the fitness distribution is really leading the dog of selection by its mutational nose, like Fisher put it. Okay. Now, you can understand the motion of the dynamics of the retrospective process in terms of an effective potential, because you looked at the way those probabilities are constructed, the transition probabilities, and you see that they are given by the original rates weighted by this quantity, which you can view as the exponential of a fitness of a potential difference. In other words, this quantity u, which is minus twice the logarithm of the reproductive value, acts as a potential in genotype space, a potential in the usual physics sense of potentials, of Markov processes. So what's this u? It's a mixture of fitness, robustness, and it's the thing that's really optimized by quasi-species dynamics. So it's flatness, if you like. It has fitness, it has flatness to it. It's the thing that's in sort of full generality is optimized. Once you understand that this effective potential acts like an energy landscape, a bunch of things just follow immediately. One is that there is a natural Lyapunov function for this, which is like any other Markov processes, the relative entropy with respect to the equilibrium distribution of the retrospective process. That's going to be monotonic, the same way entropy is monotonic in kinetic theory for the same reason. There's another interesting idea that arises, which is that of an evolutionary metastable state. We are familiar with the idea that evolution can sometimes be punctuated. One reason why this could happen is because you have a rugged landscape and the population localizes for some time at some suboptimal fitness peak before it eventually crosses a valley and goes somewhere else. This kind of intermittent dynamics translates in the language of the retrospective process into Markovian metastability. So by finding the local minima of U, which are separated by a high barrier through Arrhenius' law, that tells you that these things are going to be stable for a long time. So punctuated evolution in this language is just the metastability of the retrospective process. And finally, you have a recipe for coarse graining a big landscape. Consider a local minimum of the potential and all its basin of attraction, all those states that monotonically go to it, flow to it. That's one macro state, if you'd like, in genotype space. And so you can think of the fitness landscape on this, in this coarse grained way where you have basins of attractions and barriers between them, saddles between them. So you can study them the way you would study a molecular dynamics landscape with, for instance, barrier trees, which is what I'm representing here, where each leaf of the tree is not a genotype, but a basin of attraction of a minimum. And the height of these are how high the saddle is between any two basins.
It would be good to wrap up soon for a second time.
Yes. Not very many. Okay, there are a few more slides. I'll be quick. I just want to, I'll skip some things. I'm sorry. So to answer Daniel, ruggedness, well, the fitness landscape can be very rugged. The effective potential is much less so. What's going on here is indeed that the low peaks don't matter, the ones that are of the order of the mutation rate. So it's like having a bunch of local error catastrophes everywhere. And the beauty of this is it becomes easy now to predict evolution because what really is happening is an initial population that's concentrated here, which would be here in this landscape. Where would it go? It's not clear from the fitness landscape. It's too rugged, But from here, it's clear it's going to jump to this basin and then to this basin, which is indeed what happens. So it makes it a lot more transparent. I'm just going to say in a sentence and leave this open for question that if you consider the question of neutral evolution, so just a graph, it turns out that this retrospective process is the maximal entropy random walk on that network. So this is the process that generates entropy that has the highest entropy rate among all stationary processes. So in other words, neutral quasi-species evolution is just maximally surprising. It has the maximal entropy rate. And it also means that in terms of the molecular clock, the rate of the molecular clock, that depends on the topology of the neutral network. An eigenvalue here comes in the old Kimura formula that looked at the rate of the molecular clock in terms of mean neutral degrees. Something else really is happening here. It becomes easy to predict the motion. So a population that starts here turns out to do this kind of motion. It's obvious from the basins of attractions of the potential, and it wouldn't be from just looking at the degrees. I'll skip this. To show you this a bit more complicated landscape that I showed you at the beginning, and this is my last slide, Claude. The basin hopping graph of the fitness landscape is complex. There are multiple peaks, difficult to tell which is which. Under the coarse graining that I described here, there are very few now basins and few transitions between them. And so if you start a population in this state here, from this picture here of the potential, it's pretty clear what it's going to do. It's going to go to here, and then to here, which is interesting because this site here is in fact the highest point in the fitness landscape. It has higher fitness than this one, but it's less robust. And so you see this playing out. And when you run simulations starting from this site, 110, and you look at the frequencies in the different basins, it goes from this site to 222 in red, which is here, and then eventually to 179 here, which is almost impossible to read off the fitness landscape. Okay, I'll conclude here by arguing that evolution is really the theory of successful lineages, that the retrospective view that focuses on these lineages is a bit of a compromise between population genetics, where you look forward in time, but is unbiased, and phylogeny approach, where you look backward in time, but of course you're biased by survival because otherwise you don't observe it. The retrospective view takes a middle position here. It involves a notion of evolutionary potential, which is less rugged and more predictive than the fitness landscape itself. And to note that the intermittency of quasi-species evolution can be thought of and studied in the usual way we study metastability in biophysics, for instance. So it brings a lot of tools that we use there, like Bayer trees and so on, to bear on the issue of evolutionary dynamics. I'll stop here and I'll be delighted to take your questions if any.
There's already a question from Eric. The potential UE of genotype I depends on the mutation rate through the eigenvector Ri, right?
Correct.
So, I mean, can I maybe add something to this? So, I mean, this is very nice, this retrospective way of looking at it, right? But you do need to assume that you know what will happen infinitely into the future, right? So you need to know what is the eventual steady state that you're going to go to infinitely into the future, even if that involves things that happen on very long timescales. And then you can pull it back and define the retrospective dynamics, right?
Yes, yes. And that is information that is contained in two things: the topography of the whole fitness landscape and the mutation rate. These two things together give rise to a notion of effective potential, which then guide evolutionary dynamics. But the answer is yes. If you were lucky enough to have a fitness landscape completely assayed, then you could compute this effective potential. And no matter where you start in that potential, no matter how far from equilibrium, you can track those future trajectories because they follow the geometry of the potential.
All right, thanks.
And
yeah, so just following up on that. I mean, so with this last point about the intermittency and metastability, I mean, yeah, it works for the intermittency and metastability of the quasi-species model, but I guess in any real population, if you're talking about intermittent evolution, the quasi-species model is probably a bad one, because, you know, if it's stuck on a peak, say, that's because either it literally has 0 individuals on the other side of the peak, in which case the quasi-species model is bad, or it's obligate sexual population where, you know, it can't maintain the next the higher peaks genotype in the face of recombination, in which case, you know, you have to deal with sex. It's not asexual, or it's both quite frequently. So this model doesn't really describe any of that kind of peak escape, right?
I think it does. The obligate sexual is a different story, but you were talking about the sort of first part of your question. You will be stuck if there is nobody there, and it's going to take some time. Now, it's true that the quasi-species model will give you the wrong picture of how long it takes to get there. It will, because it includes fractional densities.
Exactly.
Yes. So that is true. However, the most likely transition remains the most likely transition in finite populations. It's the time scale that's changed. So I expect that in going to finite populations, I expect, and I claim without proving right now, that the direction remains correct. The most likely one will still be the most likely one. It's just that the time it takes has to be renormalized by population sizes. A bit like the speed of a fitness wave depends on the population size.
Yeah, I think it's more complicated than that. I mean,
Joachim, you had a question too?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of more technical point. So how is this retrospective process related to what people like Ellen Barker call the ancestral distribution? Is that more or less the same thing, or?
Yeah. So the ancestral process is, let me define the ancestral process in the following way. Go to mutation selection equilibrium, sample uniformly from that population, go back in time. Okay, so now you have obviously you have a Markov process because there is just a single ancestor for each of those. So this is a Markov process that goes backward in time. The retrospective process is the time reverse of this.
Okay, I see. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, I think we should go on to the next speaker. But thanks a lot, everybody, for thanks a lot for the talk, and thanks for the lively discussion.